All right, well, one of my subscribers, Dogatron, asked me to make some comments about GMOs and Monsantos and other corporations. And I got to be perfectly honest, I don't know a ton about Monsantos, especially their activities in India, which he specifically referenced, and how this morality, that sort of thing. Um, what I do want to talk about is it's related and it will address some of the issues involved uh, with his question is that I want to make a video more generally about corporations and corporate personhood. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone on this channel is aware that corporations receive uh, corporate personhood or personhood from the state, and it's really getting popular now in libertarian circles to uh, denounce this limited liability anyway as a subsidy. Now, the government does subsidize many corporations, uh, but I think the limited liability aspect of it is actually extremely minimal. I don't think that is much of a subsidy, and this is new to my thinking. Corporations receive direct and indirect subsidies, and it depends on which corporations how much they get. I think the biggest one by far is regulatory capture. I think it's even bigger. With the exception of, say, Lockheed, the big defense contractors who are just getting multi-billion-dollar orders from the government, um, the number one is regulatory capture. And corporate personhood and the limited liability that's there, uh, I don't think is actually much of a subsidy. And this is a change that I've had in my thinking just in the last couple of weeks. I was listening to an old Harry Brown video, and somebody called in about this very topic. And what Brown pointed out is that uh, we don't need a state to have limited liability. That would still likely exist in uh, almost all cases where there's some question of liability. So let's say me and you decide to become partners in a business, and let's just say that we both have personally large amounts of assets. Let's say we're both multimillionaires and we want to start, say, a mail service, because obviously mail services would be legal in a free market. And we get our contract, and we, of course, agree on the profit sharing and how everything's going to function. But in there, we put a clause saying, well, uh, we're not going to, our personal capital is not going to be uh, liable. And then we go and we hire a whole bunch of employees. And what do the employees do is they also sign the contract, and they say, listen, we'll work for you, but in the contract it will say if something happens, say the company goes bankrupt, and the company is unable to pay them, they can't come to us and say, well, we want your personal fortunes because we want to get paid. And the contract will say, as long as we have income, as long as the company has money, you're entitled to be paid. But if we don't have any money, the owners, me and you, are not liable. And maybe that sounds unfair, but if you put it in the contract, that's a danger that could happen. Then it's not really, they're agreeing to the limited liability. They're saying, okay, I'll work for you, and I understand that if things go bad, the two owners are not personally liable. And I am personally in this situation right now. I'm a contractor with somebody, and I know that he is wealthy. He's a multimillionaire, but I also know the company I work for is not on the best ground. And uh, it's very easy to say, well, what if I work and the company goes bankrupt? Uh, it seems like natural that I should be able to go to him and say, well, you're a millionaire, pay me my salary. Well, I think he's a millionaire. I don't actually know that, but I'm pretty sure that he is. Um, but in the contract that I signed to work for him, the condition of my labor is that I can't ask for that. Now, going outside of employer, we have our mail service. We go to our customers and we say, here's our agreements. If we'll deliver mail, here's the fees. And they also would be agreeing by contract to whatever the stipulation is. So we say, hey, Lengthy Onarthur and Dogatron, they're the owners, but they are not liable for corporate fault. If the corporation harms you, then if the corporation has funds, then you're entitled to that. So say one of our mail deliverers hits your mailbox, or hits your car, or God forbid hits one of your kids, or kills your dog or something. The corporation will be liable, but not me and them personally. And if the consumer signs that consent, then I mean they've agreed. Now I think that uh, that type of agreement is actually going to cover the vast majority of all disputes that are ever going to happen, because the vast majority of disputes that can happen lie in fairly predictable areas. You know, we know we're going to have disputes with our employers and with our neighbors and with our insurance companies, and we know we're going to have disputes with people over car damage and house damage and all the insurable things. And a large majority of questions of liability are going to actually be pre-decided. Now, the corporate limited liability scheme, it makes sense. Well, with your employees, they sign; with your consumers, they sign, so there's no question. But then you get into the what about third parties who are not contractually obligated? So our mail carrying service, our truck hits uh, like a third party who's not an employee, not. And this is, of course, would actually be. This sounds likely. Actually, it's not very likely, because obviously in a free market society, where's the car accident going to happen? It's going to happen on a private road, obviously. So there's probably going to be some kind of agreement. But let's just hypothetically assume that something happens and it's not something that's already agreed on, which I actually think is very, very unlikely. Um, the first thing is, if the dispute happens, the third party would be entitled to whatever the corporation has. And this is what Harry Brown basically said, is that uh, in almost all cases, the corporation is going to, without going into the liability of the shareholders, be able to pay whatever the damages are. I actually did not like Harry Brown's use of this argument, because he's just imagining that all corporate personhood corporations are going to be large and have enormous liquidity and enormous capital, on the wheel pays. When I work for a very small corporation, which is it's paying my salary and it's paying the operating costs, it's not making a lot more. If something were to happen, we were to say damage a car, an expensive car or something like that, it's very likely that the corporation wouldn't be able to do it. And then it comes into the question, well, shouldn't the person who was wronged say, we do $1,000,000 in damage somehow, one way or another, and the corporation itself only has $10,000. Obviously, we wouldn't be using dollars. 10,000 grams of gold, or ounces of silver. And what about the remainder? The person who was wronged, they still are owed more, and they didn't sign the limited liability thing. So what happens to them? Well, I think this question is actually a broader question, and that is, what do disputing parties do when they have no prior agreement as to how to arbitrate disputes? And the thing is again, this is very going to be only a small minority of disputes. It will happen, but it is only a very small minority of disputes. And it's a larger question of that. That has to just be resolved on individual arbitration in a body of law being built up. And I know some people are going to hear this as unsatisfactory, but we actually have that system now. If you have arguments between states that don't have agreements, you're in that same boat. Whatever you can work out is the best that you can hope for, and this is the case here. Um, if Dogatron and I's mail company uh, causes damages to somebody who is not in any way consented to the limited liability that we have, and the corporation is unable to make the payments, then we have to have arbitration between shareholders. Arbitration between the shareholders, me and Dogatron, and the aggrieved party is necessary. And there's no a priori way to decide how this is going to be resolved. I mean, what I think would happen is, as the corporation, we'd probably want to say, well, we have limited liability, so we don't have to pay any more than the corporation. You bankrupted the corporation, you have all of its assets, so there. And they would say, I am not a signatory to any of that agreement, It's through no fault of my own, so I'm entitled to more. And whatever, we both have an interest in having this be resolved. Obviously, the aggrieved party could go to file suit with a larger firm. The big thing is people think, oh, the little guy and the big guy. Well, hey, if our resources are exhausted in paying, if the corporation's resources are exhausted in paying back restitution, then we aren't that big of a firm. B, a smaller, weaker party can always take his claim to a larger party who will litigate on their behalf on the understanding that they would receive part of whatever restitution. This is why the little poor guy argument doesn't work. Uh, because the little poor guy can go, if Burger King hurts the little poor guy, he can go to McDonald's and say, this guy hurt me. If you take this case, if you litigate this, then you will get whatever, 20%, 50%. It's what lawyers do now. They get 40, 50%. So it would have to just be independent art. And then the shareholders, me and Dogatron or whoever, would be say, hey, this isn't resolved. You've done 10 times more damage than you've paid restitution in, and take it from there. And I think that the real crux of the issue, the problem in the Harry Brown show, somebody called and said, what about, sure, that's fine for the people who agree to whatever the limited liability is, the employees, the customers, whatever. And obviously it's not a problem if the corporation is able to easily pay the damages to a third party, which Harry Brown was just saying that's going to be almost every time. I think he's probably right that it's a majority of the time that does still leave the cases where it's not the case. And then you're into the area where you just have to have arbitration that has no prior agreement, which we already have now. We're always going to have some. There's not going to be much of that. I mean, like I said, what's a mail carrying service? What's the likely place we're going to have an accident? It's going to be on the road. But since the roads are private, there's almost certainly going to be some kind of insurance scheme or agreement with the roads on how to resolve disputes. I mean, I can imagine a company that's owning a road would very likely say, well, we can't allow you to drive on this road if you say your liability is capped below what the actual damages you might cause. This is like what happened with BP, where they had limited liability capped at $87 million or whatever. That's moral hazard, and if Gulf of Mexico was private, there's no way that would have happened. Whoever owned it or the conglomerate of owners would have said, well, the potential damages are a lot more than 87 million. They run into the many, many billions. And so, sure, you can drill, but you have to demonstrate that you would be able to pay that. Otherwise, we won't even let you into the Gulf of Mexico. If my mail company can't show that they could pay the likely liabilities by using the roads, then they wouldn't, by using whatever property, by delivering to whatever mall. So it's actually a very, very small number of cases. And I mean, like I said, it's a larger problem of what do you have when litigants and disputants have no prior agreement. And there's no system, even a state system can't alleviate that problem. So I don't think limited liability is the huge subsidy from the state. Corporations get lots of other subsidies from the states, and it depends on which corporation. But the corporate personhood, I don't think it is as big as I used to think that. But I actually don't think that's as bad a deal. Now, just to cap it, as far as I'm aware, Monsanto's entire business plan is based on the enforcement of copyright on its genetically modified foods. Obviously, I'm against copyright. It's kind of like Microsoft. Their entire business plan is based on the government prosecuting anybody who pirates their software, pirates it. It's not pirating. And what little I've seen of Monsanto's is they'll go to a farmer and they'll say, hey, the spores from our crops blew onto your farms and you're growing our food then. And we have a copyright to this genome, so you got to pay us whatever. Obviously, that wouldn't exist absent the state. Monsanto's could be genetically engineering food, and if their spores blew onto your property, fine by you. There's also the possibility, I've heard this, where they want to engineer them so that they can't they only grow once, so you have to keep rebuying the seeds. And well, it depends on how bad it is. If that's all it is, then I would say it's a weed the other farmer has to get rid of. If they actually make it so that he can't grow other kinds of crops, say they make some kind of killer parasite, Monsanto's thing, that destroys your crops, and that's just blatant aggression. That's aggression. That's like uh, throwing pesticides on someone's land, or whatever, herbicide. That would be grossly an assault on somebody. Even if the pesticides grew into a corn, if it kills the plants that they have and they don't want them growing there, then that is a gross assault. You'd be justified in seeking restitution for that. Um, as currently you're not. If And also, if you decided to grow their corn because it blew under your thing, they wouldn't have a right to come and demand a share of it. I've also heard of them prosecuting people for seed cleaning, something. So a process where we'll take seeds from a certain agricultural process, and they're not ready to be planted, but they have these machines that will kind of mill them a little bit and take off the husks, or the outside portions of the seed, and that's what they need to do to they'll reuse that seed to plant again. And I heard that in the past, this was every farmer did this. And the interview I saw was a farmer in Indiana said there was 50 years ago, 30 years ago, every single farmer had a machine that would mill their seeds, and then Monsanto started coming and said, you can't mill those seeds, those are our seeds, you got to pay a patent. That's obviously absurd, and that's not really related to corporate personhood. That's related to copyright and patents, and obviously those are completely absurd. So uh, I don't think this really addresses the morality, other than the aggression. If you're aggressed against by a company that has limited liability, that doesn't mean you can't seek restitution. Uh, Typically, if you are a consumer or an employee, you've probably at some point agreed to that limited liability to some extent anyway. And if you haven't, then you're starting from scratch and you're seeking justice, uh, you know, just through arbitration, through unilateral arbitration. And in terms of the GMOs, that's intellectual property. Obviously, I'm against that. I mean, Stefan Kinsella has basically revolutionized this, I think. Unfortunately, I believe his ideas have swept the field, so to speak, and all to the good that they have.